So it looks like we're going to have to do a whole series on disinformation, and I'm fine with that. We are in times where you have to really analyze the information that you're getting, who you're getting it from, where they're getting it from, because people pass things on without thinking critically about it. And I think that's what's going on here with RFK. I don't think he has ill intentions, but he is not just misinformed, but actively disinformed, I believe, by Russian intelligence. And this isn't something as sinister, maybe, as it sounds, but this is information that has been circulated into the American political discourse, the bloodstream of U.S. politics and discourse, and RFK is parroting it uncritically. Of course, the journalists that he's speaking to don't know anything about this subject, so they're not going to ask any questions about it. So let's listen to what he has to say. RFK explains the real reasons behind the Ukraine conflict.
I mean, the Ukraine war is a war that should never have happened. And by the way, my son Connor went over to Ukraine and fought over there, and he fought the Kharkiv offensive because he looked at Putin as a bully who had invaded this country.
So the war should have never happened. This is assuming that there's a element behind the scenes that pushed Putin, and he'll mention this in a few moments, pushed Putin into acting the way that he did. And he adds the bit about his son fighting there, which is irrelevant, but it's supposed to add credibility to what he's about to say, like my family has skin in the game and whatnot. But why his son went to fight, it sounds like his son went to fight for principled reasons. So I think that's laudable.
The war really was about security. It wasn't about territory for the Russians. And what the
Territory is tied to security for the Russians. This goes back centuries. So that's incorrect what he's saying there. Russia sees the expansion of its borders as the expansion of its security. And there's been a theme in Russian, Soviet, whatever you want to call it, history going back to the Russian Empire, at least a couple hundred years, of needing a security buffer. And there's never enough of a buffer. So you need to constantly keep expanding and consolidating the territory that you take over. So that, again, is not correct.
Russians for 30 years, since 1992, have been saying you cannot put NATO in Ukraine because the Russians been invaded three times through Ukraine. The last
How many times have the countries that border Russia been invaded by Russia? And as far as Russia saying you can't have NATO, what do they have to say about the independent policy decisions of free countries? These countries invited NATO, Poland especially, where I'm now, the Baltic countries, other countries bordering Russia, because Russia brutally invaded, massacred their people, brainwashed them into communism, and the destructive effects of their decades long occupation of these countries is felt until this day. That's why NATO was invited by these countries to defend themselves, defend, not attack, defend themselves against Russia.
time when Hitler invaded them, he killed 1 out of every 7 Russians. So they have a legitimate security concern also.
This is a big topic, but Hitler, of course, didn't kill 1 out of 7 Russians. He never killed anyone that I know of. Of course, his invasion led to the deaths of that many Russians, but the amount of Russians that died was not a direct result of the German invasion, but policies carried out by the state, the Soviet state then, but for shorthand, let's just use Russia or Soviet Russia. Stalin was preparing an invasion of Europe. He failed. He was only a smaller part of it then, but still an important part. In 1920, Lenin's Soviet Russia failed to invade Europe. They were defeated at the gates of Warsaw. But the plan was for Stalin to invade Europe. That's what he was preparing his military for. The attack was not imminent when Hitler invaded in June of 1941, but it probably would have occurred within 1 to 2 years after that. And there's solid research behind this. I know the main historian, Bogdan Mushau, who looked at the Russian archives. And the reason why so many Russians died is because they had an offensive posture. They had military bases right on the border with German occupied territory. Let us recall that in September of 1939, the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany jointly invaded Poland and tore it apart. For the 2 years preceding the German invasion of Soviet Russia in 1941, Stalin created military bases along the edges, airfields along the edges of that territory, maximally extended to the west. He was not expecting a German attack. When it occurred, it caught the Red Army off guard. They couldn't have changed much anyway because it would have taken months and months. They had already planned to have everything as far to the west as they could. So it was quite easy for the Germans to overrun those bases, for huge casualties to be inflicted in the first weeks and months of the war, for the city, for example, of Leningrad to be besieged and for hundreds of thousands of people to die, many of them of starvation. And of course, there are various murders and ethnic cleansing being carried out by the Germans, though much of the death of Soviet citizens occurred as a result of the policies of Stalin and the Communist Politburo. But don't expect any of this context or nuance from RFK or from any of these media people who don't know anything.
We walked away from, in the last 6 years, from two nuclear weapons missile treaties, two intermediate nuclear treaties that prevented us, prior to that, from putting missiles in Europe that could hit Moscow. So then let me go back a little. In 1992, when the Soviets disbanded the Soviet Union.
I'm not familiar with the treaties he's mentioning, but we have nuclear missiles that can hit Moscow. Maybe there would be missiles closer, but we have no problem hitting Moscow if we want to. And they have no problem, at least theoretically, though maybe that technically it's not as solid as they think it is, technically, to hit the United States, whether it's Silicon Valley, where I'm from, or Washington, D.C., or any number of places. So I think that's a minor point that's kind of irrelevant. But he's going back to the early 90s.
When Gorbachev disbanded it, he allowed us to unite Germany under East and West Germany under a NATO army.
He allowed us? So East Germany was under Soviet control, but it was not Soviet or Russian property. I mean, by default, because they controlled it. But he has no business allowing the West to reunify Germany. The Germans wanted to be reunified. The Germans are not Russians, so they didn't want to be a part of the Soviet Union. So that's strange that he says that Gorbachev allowed us, and I assume he means the West or the U.S.
Moved out the Russian army, the Red Army, 450,000 troops.
Which they should have not been there in the first place, but better late than never. The Red Army troops left Poland in the early 90s. I believe it was 1992, maybe even a little bit later, but they shouldn't have been there in the first place.
But the one promise he extracted,
unlike, let me just add, the U.S. troops who have been in NATO countries and still are in Poland or in the Baltics, they were invited there. The Red Army was not invited to protect or defend these countries. The Red Army threw out the German armed forces, and then stayed in the countries that they threw the Germans out from. They had no interest in establishing independent governments in these countries.
Said, you have to promise me that you will not move NATO to the east. James Baker, President Bush, John Major, all said in England, all said, we will not move it 1 inch to the east.
I believe what he's referring to is what's called the controversy regarding the legitimacy of eastward NATO expansion. And as far as I know, there isn't any documentary evidence of these promises being made to Gorbachev to not expand NATO. And if there were, they were verbal discussions. Of course, the Russians are going to spin it as agreements, as binding agreements. But a verbal discussion is not a binding agreement, especially when it has to do with independent countries. These independent countries have the absolute right to negotiate an alliance, a treaty with the United States, and under the terms of that treaty, to have U.S. troops in their countries, especially since they have a painful and tragic and destructive history of Russia invading, destroying their countries, murdering their elites, and ravaging their countries, raping their women. The Red Army raped several million Polish women en route to Berlin in 1944 and 1945.
And since then, we've moved it 1,000 miles to the east and into 14 countries. And the one thing they said is you can't put it in Ukraine.
So Russia has broken promises, both official treaties and verbal agreements. Verbal agreements mean nothing to especially the current occupants of the Kremlin. And so I'm sure we could come up with a list of things that the Russians haven't done. And as far as them giving ultimatums about what can and can't be done, it's rich because these countries have a terrible history of being brutalized by Russia. So they have every right to seek alliances. In the case of Ukraine, as far as I know, there were not very strong signals that Ukraine was going to become a part of NATO. The bigger thing, and this gets buried, but this is more significant than this NATO business, is that Ukraine was becoming a westernized, normalized country. It had been under the Russian boot for forever, basically. Ukraine did not exist as an independent country until it became so in the early 90s. There was only a fragment of an independent Ukraine 100 years earlier, but that was just a minor footnote in Ukraine's history, essentially. Ukrainians may beg to differ, but it wasn't a strong state. It was ultimately, within a few years after the end of World War I, consumed by the Soviets and the large proportion of Ukrainians in the west of what is now Ukraine were in the Second Polish Republic, and that's another issue.
And that's what precipitated this war. We went in there in 2014. We overthrew the government, the elected government of Ukraine, put in a government that would invite NATO in, and the Russians responded.
So the previous government was a pro-Russian government. So you have to ask the question of how independent Ukraine was prior to 2014. I've also heard and read about the U.S. overthrowing the government. I think it was more complicated than that. I believe there was a conflict going on there between Russian and Western influence over Ukraine, but Ukraine was not on the verge of entering into NATO. So I think it is kind of a conspiracy theory that the U.S. orchestrated everything that happened in Ukraine when in fact most Ukrainians did not want to be under Russian influence. And I believe it precipitated the Maidan revolution and the protests in Kyiv in 2013 was a agreement of cooperation with the European Union. So it wasn't an imminent NATO admittance. It was cooperation with the European Union as a very, very preliminary step to potentially becoming a part of the EU, which wasn't going to happen for years and years. But going back to what I started to say, Russia's worry was not that Ukraine was going to join NATO, maybe way down the line. Russia's worry is that Ukraine was becoming westernized and becoming more of a normal country, despite the problems that still persist to this day with corruption and Russian influence and all of that. It was very clearly diverging away from the Russian path. The standard of living of normal Ukrainians was beginning to surpass the Russians. And probably now, outside of the war zone, your average Ukrainian is doing better than your average Russian. You know, Russia has all kinds of social problems outside of the big cities. People are living in conditions we would find hard to believe for a 21st century society. Many Russians do not have bathrooms and indoor plumbing. They use outhouses. And so it's not an advanced society. And Ukraine was surpassing much of Russian society. And Russia, the Russian government, did not want to acknowledge that because, A, as Ukraine moves further away from Russia, it weakens the control of Russia over Ukraine. And B, and maybe this is the most important factor, Russians start looking at Ukraine and saying, hey, why the heck does this, our former republic or colony, why are they living better than we are in Mother Russia? And that could prompt people to revolt and potentially overthrow the dictatorial government.
Russians asked for a peace treaty. We negotiated one. France, Germany negotiated the Minsk Accords. And then we double-crossed the Russians and wouldn't sign it. And then in April of 2022, the Zelensky negotiated another agreement and initialed it with Putin. And Putin was withdrawing his troops. And President Biden sent Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of England, to Kiev to force Zelensky to tear up that agreement. And since then, 600,000 kids have died. And if that agreement if they just left it alone,
I've heard that as well, that the war was on the verge of ending and the West kept pushing Ukraine. It's possible. It's possible. But this business with 600,000 kids dying, I don't know what he's talking about there. That sounds ridiculous. I don't think 600,000 people have died total in this war. Maybe if you count all of the Russian soldiers and all the Ukrainian soldiers and all the civilians, every single person, maybe 600,000, but I think even that's a stretch, so I don't know what he's talking about with kids.
Lugansk would still be part of Ukraine and all of those mineral wealth, and we wanted the war, and we've spent $200 billion, which.
So we wanted what he's saying, the U.S. wanted to continue the war. To what end? What was the goal? Just to have weapons contractors making money, like you provide the money to Ukraine and then it comes back to U.S. weapons contractors? Is that what he's saying? He doesn't make it clear. But if the goal was to overthrow Russia, to have Russia collapse, I don't think that was the goal, because they would have poured more advanced weapons and into the conflict early on to really make a difference. I don't see the benefit of just having the war drag on indefinitely, other than poor leadership without a strategic vision, which I think is the problem with Europe and the United States. The U.S. wasn't willing to go full force in there, didn't want to start a direct conflict with Russia, but then Europe was too weak. And like I mentioned in my most recent videos, Europe was getting the energy, especially Germany. So Germany wasn't going to take a lead role in confronting Russia when they wanted to get back to business with Russia.
By the way, we need in this country. We've got a lot of desperate people in this country now, and we can't afford to be engaged in wars that are this close to nuclear engagement.
And so Trump is going to work on that with you. I mean, that was one of the things that you united on, right?
But he said from the beginning, I'll settle this. Whatever you say about President Trump, he's a real estate guy, and he'd rather do a deal than have a war.
Yeah.
And the Russia, I mean, it's harder now to do a good deal because the Russians have made a profound sacrifice, and they're, and now,
I don't like the language he's using, a profound sacrifice. So, a profound sacrifice for what? To ensure their security? To ensure Russia's security, or to ensure the security of the Putin regime by creating this war that engaged the population, that provided the population with money because these dead soldiers were basically like meal tickets for a lot of these families. They were paid in advance, so they passed the money on to their family, and then they died, and their bodies were, for the most part, not recovered, left on the battlefield to rot. So this profound sacrifice business is strange language to be using for what Russia is doing. But going back to what I said before, there's no historical knowledge or context about what Russia does and why Russia does it.
Putin said from the beginning, I'm scared they're going to use Ukraine to attack Russia. So now Zelensky has confirmed that by sending a NATO-supported invasion of Russia in Kursk.
So this NATO-supported invasion business is quite overblown, and he's using the Russian language, so it's obvious that he's parroting what's been handed to him, and maybe not directly by Sergei Lavrov or some Russian, diplomat, or basically a Russian intelligence agent, but passed maybe through one or two people. Maybe Lavrov gave this to Carlson, then Tucker Carlson, I won't say it, passed it on to RFK. And so it sounds legitimate. Putin was scared. I don't think Putin has been scared in a long time. He consolidated his power. He might have been scared when Yevgeny Prigozhin a couple years ago was potentially going to march on Moscow and knock him out of power, but then he executed Prigozhin and blew up his plane, which crashed. I don't think Putin, besides that, has been scared. And no, it's not a NATO invasion of Russia. It's a small diversionary attack where several hundred square miles or square kilometers, even so smaller, of Russia were occupied or still are occupied in part by Ukrainian troops as a way to divert Russian reinforcements from the front. There's no way Ukraine could ever hope to invade Russia, and I don't think they would want to, but he made the connection with Hitler in the past, and I think it's a very stupid and strange connection to make, as if this limited incursion into Russia as a defense against the Russian invasion of their country, which is another ridiculous assumption that a country that's invaded is not allowed to attack the territory of the invader. It can only fight the invader on their own territory. That goes against the common sense of war. You have to hit the enemy where they are weak, and if that means invading their territory while they're invading yours because they're unprepared for it, then you do that.
And everything the Russians were saying about this from the beginning has turned out to be true. And so,
That's not true. That's not true, and that's a stupid thing to say. Everything the Russians have been saying about this has turned out to be true. Not true. I think he's just, this is the thing with political rhetoric and being at this level of politics, is that it doesn't matter if what you say is true. It's as long as enough people swallow it to legitimize your policies. So on the one hand, it's frustrating to hear such stupid things from someone who should know better. On the other hand, it's part of the political rhetoric of legitimizing whatever moves Trump wants to make. Although if those moves are too conciliatory towards Russia and Putin, then, screw him. Screw him if he's going to sell out Europe to Putin because he got offended at Biden or something like that. It's just stupid politics if he's doing that. He better have something lined up so that it benefits the United States, it benefits the security interests of the NATO alliance. But if he's just reacting emotionally and like, oh, I'm going to show you everybody who was against me, now I'm just going to screw the countries that were against me, and in doing so, screw the Eastern European countries that are your best supporters, I don't like that. So pardon me getting a little emotional here, but you haven't seen me emotional. This is tame. But this has consequences. This isn't just political rhetoric, because this affects how people think of the conflict and how they act and how policies are legitimized and initiated in the future. So that's why I'm pushing back against this, because I think he's off base.
Oh, we need to settle that war, and we need to start building a community and a society.
The Afghan withdrawal. Your thoughts on that?
The Afghan withdrawal was a horrible calamity because it could have been done correctly. We should have taken the troops out of Afghanistan. You could do that in a way that was, it was politically driven by a date that was impossible for the army to comply with, for the military to comply with. And as a result of that, you had, I think, 37 military personnel were, lost their lives. And none of that should have happened.
And all the equipment that was left behind.
Oh, yeah, we left an entire army of equipment which is now being used against us.
Wow, wow.
So that's RFK on the real reasons for the Ukraine conflict. And as I highlighted, I think he's wrong. I think he's passing on disinformation. So misinformation could be good intention. You get the wrong information, but disinformation is a part of the active measures of Russia. This is something the Soviet Union did and that the Russian Federation continues to do. So it's a multi-generational process of passing information on to the West to skew, in this case, our policies, the United States policies, the West policies, the United States being the primary mover and shaker in NATO. So we will be continuing looking at disinformation, how it's spread, and I am going to try to dig in to see where RFK got his information from. Of course, RFK is not a geopolitical person. That's not what he ran as. Of course, he ran as an independent presidential candidate, but his focus is on health, and that's why Trump brought him into the administration. So I think he's out of his league on Russia and Ukraine, but he's being used here to appeal to a certain portion of Trump's electorate and probably to Democrats as well who support RFK but probably don't like Trump. So he spreads this message. The reporters, of course, are not people who know anything about this conflict, so they're just going to let him speak as they did here, and they just aren't going to push back at all. And there should be pushback, and I hope that governments in Europe realize this, and that as much as there is euphoria for Trump, especially among conservatives in Europe, that there are also dangers. I don't think it's a good look or a good sign that Trump has been as pro Putin as he has been. Putin did invade Ukraine. Yes, there are factors of Western involvement that led to that, but ultimately, this is the modus operandi, the way that Russia has behaved for several centuries of expanding its territory to enhance its security. That's what it says, but at the expense of countries that wanted nothing to do with attacking Russia or invading Russia. They're small countries, the Baltic countries, even Poland is small and weak compared to Russia. So there's no interest in invading Russia. And moreover, as I said, the security has more to do with the security of the current Putin regime than it does with Russia and the Russian people. Most Westerners don't wish the Russian people any ill, but Putin and his people in the Kremlin have muddied the waters significantly. Putin is not looking out for the interests of normal Russians. He wouldn't have engaged in this terrible war that's led to the deaths of several hundred thousand Russians and huge use of resources and enormous ill will against Russia throughout the Western world. But the security, as I said, it's about securing his regime and about knocking Ukraine out of any contention to join with the EU, to join with NATO, and most of all, for Russians not to see that Ukraine was becoming a more normal and prosperous country than Russia was. That's the biggest threat to Putin and his people. Hopefully, the Russians can open their eyes to what they are up against, but that's their business. We in the West have to focus on our own security, especially here in Poland. Poland has to focus on its security, and I hope more effort will be made to try to convince President Trump that Putin's intentions are not good and honest, and that working too closely with him is not in the interests of the United States, NATO, or of Europe. I think President Duda has done that in his recent meeting with Trump yesterday or the day before yesterday at the CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington. But it has to be repeated, because for every one conversation like that Trump has with someone who knows what the threats are here, he's going to have all kinds of people pushing him information, either directly or indirectly, disinformation coming from Russia. People like Tucker Carlson, obviously RFK is under influence either from Carlson or from others, and Russia has a lot more experience and resources available for these soft measures of manipulating public opinion in the West. So let's stay focused on what we can do and don't drop your guard. Talk to you next time.